Hello. Welcome to Season 10 of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. In each episode, we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season, our theme is Because We Have the Microphone. And because we have the microphone, you will listen as we discuss a bunch of movies that we just kind of feel like watching with no rhyme or reason. Think of it as a collection of movies that we've referenced a lot in previous seasons or been curious about for a long time. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Took a little trip back to the 1930s this week.
I thought we were past it. Apparently it came back to bite us in the ass.
It did indeed. But it was really interesting after doing last season where we did like the 100 Years of Horror and went through 2 horror movies from every decade, and having like movies from the 20s and 30s and 40s to kind of put this one into context with was really interesting for me. And I don't think I would have appreciated it as much or like caught on to as much or found it as interesting had we not done that recently.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it was almost like returning home after a long trip, like watching this film, because we had like a huge, a few decades where the films were like this style.
Yeah.
So it was almost like just at home. Yeah,
I could see that. I felt like it was more like going on vacation back to a place you'd been on vacation to before.
Ah, that's a good point. That's a better analogy.
I'm really just trying to contradict you because I want to like add some sparks in this episode.
Oh, okay.
Spicy.
You can kiss my ass. If we're adding sparks here, buddy.
It worked. I love it. Okay. I'm going to introduce this one, and then you can do your fun facts, and then we will get into the bloody details.
Whatever.
In 1932, Universal Pictures brought the world Murders in the Rue Morgue, an American horror film based on an Edgar Allan Poe short story with basically the same name. It stars Bela Lugosi in the role of a mad scientist who is obsessed with the idea of injecting ape blood into a human to prove that they are genetically compatible and thus from a similar origin. This movie was made on a budget of just under $200,000 in 1932 money. For reference, Frankenstein was made on a budget of about $262,000 in 1931, and The Invisible Man was made on a budget of around $328,000 in 1933. Murders in the Rue Morgue can currently be rented for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. So what did you learn about this movie?
So I learned a couple things. This is based off of Edgar Allan Poe poem. That was kind of a guess. But here's a couple facts about Edgar Allan Poe that I thought were kind of interesting. He married his 13-year-old cousin.
That doesn't seem great.
I know. In 1829, Poe met 7-year-old Virginia Clem, his first cousin on his mother's side. After living with the child's family for nearly 6 years, Poe asked her mother for permission to marry the young girl, promising to financially support her and her desperately poor family. She agreed. The 27-year-old wed the 13-year-old the following year. They remained married until Clem died from tuberculosis 11 years later. Today, historians are unsure about the romantic extent of the relationship, as many believe that they shared a bond resembling that of a brother and sister. That just sounds like covering up for the 1%. Similarly, there are disagreements about how common such an arrangement was. While some hold that first cousin marriages were not unusual during this time, many agree their age difference would have been considered strange. Basically, it sounded like a guy who writes weird poetry got away with marrying a 13-year-old underage girl, unfortunately. And then she died early. Pretty sad. The cause of his death, though, is still unknown. So Clem's was obviously had a profound effect on Poe. As she grew sicker, he began abusing alcohol. While it was during the time that the Raven made him a household name, he was unable to enjoy and handle his newfound fame, a fact made worse by Clem's passing just 2 years after Poem's publication. Basically, Poe's mental state gradually deteriorated. In 1849, a man found him incoherent and half-consciously wandering the streets of Baltimore. Curiously, he appeared to be wearing another person's clothing, and he kept calling out the name Reynolds. While the delirious 40-year-old was quickly taken to the hospital, he died the following morning. What was the cause of death? Today, no one knows. Strangely, all medical records have been lost, and no death certificates appeared in existence. He could still be alive for all we know.
He's totally faked it.
Yeah. I mean, he could be like 180 years old right now.
Yeah. Still living off the royalties from that hit poem.
Yeah. That overnight success that probably took like 4 weeks to happen. So the last thing I have about this actual film, other than the person who wrote the poem is based off of, this was part of the resurgence of shock theater in the 50s. And I kind of wanted to talk about it, and I know it's not necessarily 100% fact about this, but I find this a little bit more interesting. So, basically, shock theater is a package of 52 pre-1948 horror films. Well, I guess this is technically part of shock theater, but anyway, in October 1957, Screen Gems basically put out these shock theaters, and it's like a few horror, spy, mystery films, just kind of like what you would have like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, Invisible Man, The Wolf Man. That was all part of like this shock theater, and became really famous. In fact, they did another one, and it was called Son of Shock, and I believe that those were released for television by Screen Gems in 1958 with 20 horror films from both Universal and Columbia. But the reason why I want to bring this up is like that's such a cool idea that I kind of wish that more non-horror related or non-like classic Turner movie related channels would do. Like, I feel like that could really help. Like, even around Halloween, how badass would it be if, like, TBS, who does, like, the 24 hours of Christmas Story, were to just, like, have, like, Shock Theater Week or something, and, and just push out all these horror films and kind of get resurgence going. But this was part of the original one. It showed on there and had great success. Just kind of like a little resurgence from that. It wasn't the oldest film on there. That was Dracula, but it lost out by 1 year, so yeah. But anyway, those are the fun facts I have.
Yeah, so you mentioned this having like some of those other movies as contemporaries, what we would think of as sort of the classic Universal monster movies. And this one was from Universal. It was sort of at the beginning of that run, but this one definitely doesn't have the reputation that those others do. I mean, like, you don't think about Murders in the Rue Morgue in the same breath as like Wolfman and Invisible Man and Dracula and Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein and all that. To me, I had never even heard of it until I started looking at some lists of like most disturbing horror movies, and I wasn't really sure what to expect going into it, but I was curious because it does star Bela Lugosi, who is, part of the ingredients you would put in the mix of a very successful, long-lived, iconic horror movie in the early 1900s, like that's just sort of part of it. And so I was curious as to why this one didn't have more renown or like fame. Like, why wasn't this on the same level as that hit poem, The Raven?
Yeah.
And I was thinking like, well, maybe it's like really low budget. You know what I mean? Like, maybe we didn't have like the preserved copies that were as high a quality, and so over time people haven't been able to experience it fully. But I thought the sound and production and all of that stuff were not really far off from like, Frankenstein or any of those. But I went down this rabbit hole because it stood out to me very early on in this movie that it seemed a little bit racy compared to the other stuff we'd watched or from around the same era. Like all of the drinking and partying at the carnival in the beginning, and just kind of some of the dialogue in there where they're asking about those dancers, and they're like, do they bite? And yes, but you have to pay extra for that. And, could you learn to dance like that for me? And stuff like that. It's like, that was in such a contrast to other things we've watched from that time that I was really curious if this one had gotten in trouble for any of that. And I saw that a lot of this is on the Wikipedia page, but it basically, like, censor boards in the U.S. Cut out a bunch of stuff from this one when it was first being shown. And so, like, that first murder and when she was tied up in the laboratory, and then some of the scenes with, like, the dancing girls at the beginning, and then elements of the plot that suggested man evolved from apes.
Right, yeah.
Which would make this film not make one bit of sense. Like,
right.
They're basically like, oh yeah, we just took out everything that makes this already weird plot kind of hold together. And so I can see why definitely in the 30s it may not have had a great reception, and why it didn't really catch on and gain that kind of commercial success that the other movies from Universal from around that era did.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say too. I mean, like, I didn't do that much research, but just based off the plot of this story, I feel like the second you talk about, Darwinism or whatever,
Yeah.
that you're just like, oh, okay, like this is the type of story, like what you were just talking about, that I expected us to talk more about when we were doing the films last season, like the early films, like,
yeah.
But we didn't have one that was nearly that bad. In fact, there was a couple that we were like, it's surprising that they were able to get away with, like, talking about well, then you found the perfect example of the censorship that America did, where it gutted the film. It took out everything that's important to this film. It was definitely gutted out, which is kind of a bummer. But like you're kind of saying, it was exciting for me to see like that German kind of expressionism style of film, cinematography, with the shadows and all that. Just it was nice, and it was cool that we did it last season, so it was comfortable with us this season. But at the same time, the story was still, like, hard for me to follow. I can see why it was a horror movie in the 30s, based off of, like, being afraid of, like, mixing blood with the ape because of how far we've come over, just in this amount of time. But at the same time, you're just like, oh, this is like, you guys are really dramatic about combining blood. I feel like it would just literally be like, here's
one
some,
done,
here's
work,
another,
okay.
pour it in a cup, and it's mixed. But it was exciting to see, like, more of that style of film, and which is cool. Like, some of the shots that they did, I mean, especially with Bela Lugosi, like when he's talking at the beginning and his eyebrows are kind of like flared up, and it kind of looks like almost like demonic in a way. You're just like, oh, okay, yep, there's the shadow, there's the the same, I don't know, it's just Bela Lugosi, it's just that hits home for us,
That's my Dracula.
Yeah, exactly. It was cool though.
Yeah, this one, I wouldn't call it necessarily the best movie from this era that we've watched, but it was interesting. And in the beginning, I was like, maybe the first quarter of the movie was basically the template for teen horror movies today, where you've got three couples that are out partying and being debaucherous, and then they, like, find their way into a dangerous situation that they're mostly oblivious towards. So when they were all, like, kind of still in the tent after everyone else had left, and it's like, no, you should be leaving this obviously dangerous situation, but you're going towards it instead because that's how horror movies work. And it's like, oh yeah, that's like what all of them did after this too. It was sort of like the paired up young couples who were, like out having fun, being on the edge, doing things their parents wouldn't approve of, and then horror finds them.
Yeah. It's like, that is the typical, story. It's crazy to think about, because I didn't think of it that way until you just said that. But, that's exactly what those, what the resurgence of those horror films did. That's fantastic.
Yeah. One thing that was kind of weird, too, for me with this one is, I don't know if there were just, some skips in the stream, if I was having internet issues or something, or if there were just some really, really rough scene edits. Did you notice that?
Really rough scene edits, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's what I noticed this time, too, myself.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So that's another thing where maybe it didn't quite live up to the cinematic experience of some of the other Universal movies around the time, because I didn't really notice a lot of that in the others. But,
yeah. I think it was. I mean, this one did seem extremely rough, and I know that I had a couple films of we were kind of surprised by the quality of film that we got back then, and maybe I was just kind of expecting. Actually, I'll tell you a quick story about this film. What happened to me was I selected the film, even though you text me and you clarified which one we're watching, because you're the responsible one in this relationship.
I do what I can.
I was like, okay, I'm going to watch this. Got on Amazon, searched for it, saw it, rented it, went on about my life, started watching it, and I thought, I didn't know much about it. I was just going in blind, and so I was like, gosh, this is actually really interesting. And it was in color, and I was like, wait, isn't this supposed to be old? And I was like, no, don't worry about it. Got about 10 minutes into it, and I realized it was the one from the 70s.
Oh, that is why I texted you to confirm.
Yeah, I was like, oh, that's my bad. Oh yeah, because then you texted it. Yeah, I was just ignoring that part, I guess, because I was just like. Anyways, regardless, one day we should watch it, because I only watched the first 10 minutes and it was really interesting. So I already had that in my mind, and then I went into this, so it made it a little bit more difficult, I think, because I was into the one in the from the 70s. I was into it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is. It wasn't like it was the best film ever, but it was just it had my attention, and then it hit me, and I was like, oh shoot. So I had to go back here, and so I think I went into this a little bit more rough with some of my opinions because of my mistake. Now I will say, it was incredibly, for me, it was kind of hard to follow, understanding exactly everything. That's also the black and white movie curse that I have, where it's I struggle to remember faces. If for some reason I can only recognize faces if it's in color almost. Or unless it's a film I've seen 100 times. And so I struggled, wait, was this the guy at the beginning? So it wasn't that pleasurable for me to watch this one.
Well, it was so hard to tell the characters apart that most of them didn't know the difference between a chimpanzee and a gorilla. So there's that.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But yeah, it felt all over the place. And there were some legit intense horror scenes, like the one where he's torturing that girl he captured on the street.
Yeah.
That was crazy for the time, and more graphic than you would expect.
Yep.
But then there's the scene right after where Camille gets kidnapped by the monkey, and all the people go into the room to investigate, and then there's the whole stupid Three Stooges routine about what language was overheard in Camille's room that went on for 20 minutes out of the 60-minute movie. But then they find there's a super intense scene where they find the mom's body hanging from the chimney.
Yep.
And it's just where are we at? This thing is going everywhere. It's kind of slapstick, stupid comedy to super graphic corpse to what is going on right now? And then I just never really knew what to expect. And so it felt like the mood of the movie was just all over the place. And that didn't really pull me in and keep me on the edge of my seat from a horror perspective. it just felt less coherent, I guess, than some of the other movies.
Do you think it was difficult for Bela Lugosi to be in a horror film that's a year later than Dracula and it not be nearly as successful or like legendary as Dracula? Because like even reading about this, it was talking about how it did make like 21,000 in its week at the theater, but did poor business nationally compared to Dracula and Frankenstein.
Yeah.
You think he was like, I mean, I still am on the list of best horror films.
Yeah. I have no basis for this, but in my mind, he is like Samuel L. Jackson.
Oh, okay.
In that, like, he's in it for the love of the game. He's only taking roles that he finds interesting. And if this movie bombs, it doesn't matter because he's going to do one next year that might not.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, back to the film, I did think that... So at the beginning, like, when the guys and girls are all talking, it's going from, conversation to conversation, that slapstick kind of humor that was going on. I thought to myself, what are we getting ourselves into? Like, is this was this like a mystery? Because like I said, yeah. I just went into it blind, and I like doing that nowadays because there's no expectation. Like I just go straight in. But at the same time, seeing that slapstick comedy, like I know we've talked about this in horror films, how sometimes it's nice to break it up, and it's really nice if it's like a comedy horror film, like any of the Evil Dead or Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. But this was just so out of place, and like there was no like rhyme or reason for it other than just
yeah. So overall, this one was just a weird experience, kind of start to finish, and I can definitely see why it didn't reach the heights reputation wise that some of the other like 1930s Universal monster movies and Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven reached. But I think that I'm glad we watched it. I think it's Bela Lugosi. It was a good time. I probably won't watch it again, but I feel like it is one of like the weirder horror movies from the time period, and that's what we're kind of into.
Yeah, I think for me this is an obvious like example of what can happen with censorship of films. And not just...
Well, this one was hard to follow uncensored.
Right.
Like, I can't imagine if you just took all the plot points out.
100%. Yeah, that's the exact point. It's like, this is... If that was the case, and of course, it didn't have a bigger following, and for all we know, it could have been, like how we talk about Bride of Frankenstein being one of the classics, and I'll speak for myself in this, but it wasn't my favorite classic horror film, Bride of Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. It was almost a little annoying. This could have had that opportunity, it just never got the chance because of the censorship, and I hate the fact that people were trying to put out their... I don't even know if this was a political statement with like the Darwinism or anything like that. I'm just saying they were trying to put out what they thought was a horror film and got censored, and then obviously got kind of screwed over from that. Now, that being said, it was still hard to follow anyway, and I've seen it. I don't know if I would need to see it again, is my stance with this film.
I had said in the beginning that I kind of wanted this to be, get some sparks flying. I can't disagree with the word you just said.
That's what I thought too. I was like, oh, we don't have too many disagreements throughout this.
Well, hugs. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, sounds good. See ya.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com. Or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.